On the evening of June 8, 1977, a telephone repairman named Jack Mercer climbed a utility pole on a quiet residential street in Falls Church, Virginia, and accidentally tapped into a conversation that would lead to the largest mass arrest of Soviet intelligence operatives in Cold War history. He was 31 years old, had been working for Chesapeake Telephone Company for 9 years, and he was supposed to be fixing a problem with static on Mrs. Henderson's landline. Instead, he found himself listening to two men speaking Russian, discussing dead drops and agent networks, and something they kept referring to as the October package. Jack didn't speak Russian, but he knew enough to recognize it when he heard it, and he knew enough to understand that residential phone lines in suburban Virginia were not supposed to carry conversations in foreign languages about things that sounded very much like espionage. Jack Mercer had grown up in Richmond, the son of a mechanic and a schoolteacher, and he had drifted into telephone repair work the way a lot of young men drifted into trades in the late 1960s. It paid reasonably well, it kept him outdoors, and it required just enough technical skill to be interesting without being overwhelming. He married his high school girlfriend, Karen, in 1970. They had 2 kids by 1975, a boy and a girl, and they lived in a small ranch house in Springfield, where the mortgage was manageable and the neighbors were friendly. Jack's job was straightforward. Customers called to report problems with their phone service. Dispatchers assigned work orders. Jack drove to the address, diagnosed the issue, and fixed it. Sometimes the problem was in the house, a faulty jack or corroded wiring. Sometimes it was outside, damaged lines or malfunctioning junction boxes. And sometimes, like today, the problem was somewhere in between, requiring him to trace the line from the street all the way back to the central switching station. The work order for June 8th was for a Mrs. Dorothy Henderson at 1847 Lawton Street in Falls Church. She had complained about persistent static on her line for the past week, and 2 previous repair attempts hadn't solved the problem. Jack arrived at 5:30 in the afternoon, introduced himself to Mrs. Henderson, a widow in her 70s, who insisted on offering him iced tea before he even opened his toolbox, and then went outside to begin the diagnostic process. He started at the junction box mounted on the side of her house, testing the connection with his multimeter. The readings looked normal. He traced the line back to the utility pole at the street, climbed up with his belt and spikes, and began checking the distribution box, where multiple residential lines connected to the main trunk. It was while he was up there, 20 feet above the ground, with the sun starting to sink toward the horizon, that he heard it. He had connected his test set, a handheld device that allowed him to monitor phone lines, to Mrs. Henderson's circuit. But instead of silence or the normal background hum of an active line, he heard voices. 2 men speaking in what sounded like a foreign language, their conversation clear and uninterrupted. Jack froze, one hand gripping the pole, the other holding the test set to his ear. His first thought was that he had accidentally crossed into someone else's line, that the wiring at the distribution box was faulty and signals were bleeding between circuits. But when he checked the connections, everything looked correct. He was definitely monitoring Mrs. Henderson's line. And yet the voices continued. He listened for perhaps 30 seconds, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. The language was definitely not English. It had a harsh, consonant-heavy quality that made him think Eastern European, Russian maybe, or Polish. He couldn't be sure. But what struck him more than the language itself was the tone of the conversation. It was professional, businesslike, the kind of exchange you might hear between co-workers discussing project details. Except, these details included words and phrases that Jack didn't need to understand Russian to find concerning. One of the men said something that included the English words, dead drop. The other responded with what sounded like confirmation, then said something else that included Georgetown and Thursday. Then the first man said something longer, and Jack caught the phrase October package, spoken in English, before the conversation shifted back into Russian. Jack's hand started to shake. He disconnected the test set and sat there on the pole, trying to think. There were explanations that didn't involve espionage. Maybe it was a crossed wire carrying a conversation from a different location entirely. Maybe it was some kind of radio interference. Maybe he was jumping to conclusions based on spy movies and Cold War paranoia. But the conversation had been too clear, too direct, and it had been on Mrs. Henderson's residential phone line. And Jack knew enough about telephone infrastructure to know that random conversations in foreign languages didn't just appear on suburban landlines by accident. He climbed down from the pole, walked back to Mrs. Henderson's door, and told her he needed to run an additional test at the central office, that he would return the next day to complete the repair. She seemed disappointed that her phone wasn't fixed immediately, but Jack promised he would resolve it soon. Then he drove back to the Chesapeake telephone depot, parked his truck, and sat in the cab for 20 minutes, trying to decide what to do. The smart thing would be to report it to his supervisor. But report what exactly? That he had heard two men speaking Russian on a customer's phone line? His supervisor, a man named Daniels, who had worked for the phone company for 30 years, and had the patience of someone who had heard every possible excuse for delayed work orders, would probably tell Jack to stop watching so many spy movies and get back to fixing phones. But there was another option. Jack could go back. He could monitor the line again, record what he heard, and gather actual evidence before bringing it to anyone. It would mean working off the clock, and it would mean lying to Karen about where he was. But it would also mean he would have something concrete instead of a vague story about foreign conversations. That night, Jack told Karen he had to go back out for an emergency repair. She was annoyed, but not surprised. Emergency calls were part of the job, and she was used to him disappearing at odd hours. He kissed the kids goodnight, grabbed his tool belt and test set, and drove back to Falls Church. He parked his truck 2 blocks away from Mrs. Henderson's house, walked to the utility pole, and climbed up in the darkness. The street was quiet. Most of the houses had their lights on, families inside having dinner or watching television, completely unaware that a telephone repairman was sitting on a pole above their street, listening for Soviet spies. Jack connected his test set to Mrs. Henderson's line and waited. For the first 15 minutes, there was nothing. Just the empty hum of an open circuit. He was about to give up, convinced he had imagined the whole thing, when the line clicked active. The same 2 voices, the same Russian. But this time, Jack was ready. He had brought a small cassette recorder, the kind Karen used to record the kids singing, and he had rigged it to connect to his test set with a patch cable. He pressed record and let the conversation flow onto the tape. The men spoke for approximately 8 minutes. Jack didn't understand most of it, but he caught fragments in English. Connecticut Avenue. Tuesday, 9 p.m. Package ready. Confirmation received. And then, near the end of the conversation, one of the men said something that made Jack's blood run cold. He said, "If the network is compromised, execute Protocol 7 and disappear." The line went dead. Jack stopped the recording, disconnected his equipment, and climbed down from the pole with legs that felt like water. He sat in his truck with the cassette tape in his hand, staring at it like it was a live grenade. Because that's effectively what it was. Evidence of something that was either a massive security breach or the biggest misunderstanding of his life. By the time Jack got home, it was past 10 p.m. Karen was asleep on the couch, the television still flickering with the late news. Jack didn't wake her. He went to the garage, found a screwdriver, and took apart the cassette tape housing. He removed the tape itself and hid it inside an old coffee can on a shelf behind some paint supplies. Then he went to bed and didn't sleep. The next morning, Jack called in sick to work. Daniel sounded annoyed, but told him to rest up and come back when he felt better. Then Jack drove to a payphone outside a drugstore in Alexandria and called the FBI. The receptionist who answered asked how she could help him. Jack said he needed to report possible espionage. There was a pause, the kind of pause that suggested the receptionist received calls like this more often than Jack would have guessed. And then she transferred him. A man answered, identifying himself as Special Agent Thomas Riley. Jack told him about the conversation he had intercepted, about the Russian language and the English phrases and the recording he had made. When he finished, Riley asked him to repeat certain details. Where exactly was the phone line? What was the address? What time did the conversation occur? Could Jack come to the FBI field office immediately? Jack said yes. Riley gave him an address on 4th Street. Jack hung up, got back in his truck, and drove into Washington, D.C. with the coffee can containing the cassette tape sitting on the passenger seat. The FBI field office was a nondescript building that could have housed any kind of government agency or corporate office. Jack walked in, told the security guard he had an appointment with Special Agent Riley, and was escorted to a conference room on the 3rd floor. Riley was waiting with another agent, a woman named Special Agent Catherine Morse. Both were in their mid-30s. Both had the kind of alert, focused demeanor that made Jack feel like he was being evaluated from the moment he walked through the door. Riley asked Jack to sit down and tell them everything. Jack told them about Mrs. Henderson's static problem, about climbing the pole and hearing the conversation, about going back at night to record it. He pulled the cassette tape from the coffee can and handed it to Morse, who immediately left the room with it. Riley asked Jack if he had told anyone else about this. Jack said no, just them. Riley asked if he was certain the conversation was on Mrs. Henderson's residential line and not bleeding over from somewhere else. Jack explained the technical details, the distribution box configuration, the testing procedures he had used. He was certain. Morse returned 20 minutes later. She nodded to Riley, and Riley leaned forward. He told Jack that the conversation on the tape was indeed in Russian, and that the FBI had linguists reviewing it right now. But from what they could tell so far, it appeared to be 2 intelligence operatives coordinating a dead-drop operation scheduled for the following Tuesday. Then Riley said something that made Jack's stomach drop. He said the phone line at 1847 Lawton Street was registered to Dorothy Henderson, but Dorothy Henderson had died 3 months ago. The house had been sold to a couple named Martin and Elise Volkoff, who had moved in 6 weeks ago. The Volkoffs had kept the utilities in the previous owner's name, a common enough practice during transitional periods, but combined with what Jack had recorded, it suggested something far more concerning. Riley asked Jack if he would be willing to help the FBI. Jack asked what that meant. Riley explained that the Bureau needed to identify who was using that phone line and where the conversations were originating. The most likely scenario was that the Volkoffs had installed some kind of bypass or secondary line that was running through Mrs. Henderson's connection, using it as cover. If Jack could access the junction box again and trace the actual signal path, it might reveal where the conversations were really coming from. Jack wanted to say no. He wanted to hand over the tape, let the professionals handle it, and go back to his normal life of fixing static and installing jacks. But Riley emphasized that time was critical. The dead drop was scheduled for Tuesday, which was 4 days away. If the FBI could identify the full network before then, they could potentially arrest multiple operatives simultaneously. But they needed technical information that only someone with Jack's access and expertise could provide. Jack heard himself agreeing. Riley told him to return to 1847 Lawton Street, as if he were completing the original repair work. While he was there, he should map out the exact wiring configuration at the junction box and the distribution terminal. If possible, he should identify any additional lines or connections that didn't match the standard residential setup. He should take photographs if he could do so without being obvious. And he should pay attention to the Volkoffs, note their behavior, their movements, anything that seemed unusual. Jack left the FBI office with a sense of surreal detachment, as if he had stepped into someone else's life. He stopped at a hardware store and bought a small camera, the kind that could fit in his shirt pocket. Then he drove to Falls Church. He knocked on the door of 1847 Lawton Street just after 2:00 p.m. A woman answered. She was perhaps 40, with dark hair pulled back in a bun and an accent that was vaguely European. She identified herself as Elise Volkov. Jack explained that he was from the telephone company, that he was following up on a repair order filed by the previous resident, and that he needed to check the external connections. Elise seemed confused, saying they hadn't reported any problems with their phone. Jack explained that sometimes issues carried over from previous installations, and it was standard procedure to verify everything was working correctly when new residents moved in. Elise hesitated, then said her husband wasn't home, and asked if Jack could come back later. Jack said he only needed to access the external equipment, that he wouldn't need to enter the house. Elise considered this, then nodded and closed the door. Jack walked to the junction box on the side of the house and opened it. At first glance, everything looked standard, but when he traced the connections more carefully, he noticed something odd. There was a secondary line spliced into the main connection, a thin wire that ran up the side of the house and disappeared under the eaves. Jack climbed the utility pole and examined the distribution terminal more carefully. The secondary line connected to a separate circuit that wasn't part of the standard residential configuration. It was a professional installation. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing had created a parallel phone line that used Mrs. Henderson's service as cover, but actually routed to a completely different location. Jack pulled out the small camera and photographed the junction box, the secondary wire, and the connection points at the distribution terminal. Then he used his test set to trace the signal path of the secondary line. It took him nearly 45 minutes, but he eventually determined that the line ran not into the Volkov house, but to a separate structure behind the property, a detached garage that sat at the back of the lot, partially obscured by trees. Jack climbed down from the pole and walked around the side of the house, pretending to inspect the phone line route. From the street, the garage looked ordinary, but as he got closer, he noticed details that didn't fit. The windows were covered from the inside, with what looked like blackout material. There was a new-looking padlock on the door, and he could hear a faint humming sound, like electrical equipment running. He was standing there, trying to decide whether to risk getting closer, when a voice behind him said, "Can I help you?" Jack turned and found himself face to face with a man in his late 40s, thin and pale with wire-rimmed glasses. Martin Volkov. He was holding a bag of groceries and looking at Jack with an expression that was polite, but cold. Jack explained that he was checking the phone line routing, that there had been reports of interference in the area. Martin said he hadn't noticed any problems. Jack said that was good, that he was just completing a routine survey. Martin continued to stare at him with those cold eyes, and Jack felt sweat start to run down his back despite the mild temperature. Jack said he was all finished and would be going. Martin didn't move, didn't say anything, just watched as Jack walked back to his truck, loaded his equipment, and drove away. Jack checked his rearview mirror 3 times to make sure he wasn't being followed. He went straight to the FBI office. Riley and Morse met him in the same conference room, and Jack laid out everything he had found: the secondary phone line, the detached garage, the blackout windows, and the humming equipment, the photographs he had taken, and the unsettling encounter with Martin Volkov. Morse studied the photographs while Riley took notes. Then Riley said they needed to move quickly. If Martin Volkov was suspicious, there was a chance the network would go dark, destroy evidence, or disappear entirely. The FBI would establish surveillance on the property immediately and begin the process of securing a warrant to search the garage. Riley also said that Jack should not return to the Volkov property under any circumstances, that his involvement had been invaluable, but was now finished. Jack felt relief wash over him, followed immediately by a strange sense of disappointment, as if he had been pulled out of a game just as it was getting interesting. Over the next 3 days, the FBI conducted intensive surveillance on 1847 Lawton Street. They photographed everyone who entered or left the property. They monitored the phone line Jack had identified and recorded multiple conversations in Russian. They cross-referenced Martin and Elise Volkov's background and discovered that while their documentation appeared legitimate on the surface, deeper investigation revealed inconsistencies that suggested false identities. On Tuesday, June 14th, the scheduled dead-drop day, FBI agents followed Martin Volkov as he left his house at 8:30 p.m. and drove to Georgetown. He parked near Dumbarton Oaks Park, walked to a specific bench, and sat down. At exactly 9:00 p.m., another man approached, sat on the opposite end of the bench, and after a few minutes, both men stood up and walked in opposite directions. Surveillance teams followed both individuals. The second man led agents to an apartment building in DuPont Circle. Within hours, the FBI had identified him as Yuri Petrov, a supposed trade representative at the Soviet Commercial Office, but actually a known KGB officer. The network was beginning to take shape. On June 16th, federal agents executed search warrants simultaneously at 1847 Lawton Street, the apartment in DuPont Circle, and 3 other locations in the Washington area. The detached garage behind the Volkov house contained exactly what the FBI suspected it would: a sophisticated radio communication setup capable of transmitting encrypted messages to Moscow, photographic equipment for copying documents, false identity papers, coded correspondence, and stacks of classified materials that had been stolen from various government agencies. Martin and Elise Volkov were arrested, along with Yuri Petrov and 6 other individuals identified as part of their network. The FBI described it as one of the most significant counterintelligence operations of the decade, a spy ring that had been operating in the Washington area for at least 3 years, gathering information on defense contracts, diplomatic communications, and strategic policy documents. The investigation revealed that the Volkovs were not a married couple, but 2 separate intelligence officers who had been paired for the operation. Martin Volkov was actually Pavel Sokolov, a career KGB officer who had been operating under deep cover in the United States since 1974. Elise Volkov was Tatiana Ivanova, an intelligence specialist who had entered the country on a forged Canadian passport in 1975. The network they had built was extensive. They had recruited or coerced several low-level government employees who provided access to classified materials. They coordinated with other Soviet operatives throughout the East Coast. And they used the detached garage, which they had specifically selected when purchasing the property, as a communications hub for transmitting intelligence back to Moscow. The phone line setup that Jack had discovered was particularly sophisticated. By splicing into the deceased Mrs. Henderson's account and creating a secondary circuit that routed to the garage, they had established a communications channel that appeared from billing records to be a normal residential line. Anyone monitoring phone company records would see usage attributed to a 70-year-old widow who had lived on Lawton Street for 40 years. It was nearly perfect cover, but it had one vulnerability. The line still needed maintenance. And when Mrs. Henderson's old service started generating static, probably due to corroded connections from years of use, the phone company dispatched a repairman. And that repairman happened to be someone who noticed when things didn't add up. Pavel Sokolov and Tatiana Ivanova were both charged with espionage and conspiracy. They were tried in federal court in closed proceedings due to the classified nature of the evidence. Both were convicted and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Yuri Petrov, who claimed diplomatic immunity, was declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States. The other 6 individuals arrested received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. The classified materials recovered from the garage included documents from the Department of Defense, the State Department, and the National Security Council. The damage assessment took months, But analysts concluded that while no nuclear secrets or war plans had been compromised, the Soviets had gained valuable insights into American defense procurement, diplomatic strategy, and intelligence priorities. Jack Mercer's role in uncovering the network was kept classified for more than a decade. The FBI issued a brief press release stating that the spy ring had been discovered through routine counterintelligence work, with no mention of telephone repair or intercepted conversations. Jack received a letter from FBI Director William Webster, personally thanking him for his service, but he was instructed never to discuss the case publicly. He went back to work at Chesapeake Telephone Company the week after the arrests, and when coworkers asked where he had been, he told them he'd had the flu. Daniels grumbled about the backlog of work orders and told Jack to get caught up. Jack spent the next several weeks climbing poles, fixing static, and installing new lines, and nobody suspected that he had just helped dismantle a major Soviet intelligence operation. But 3 months later, in September 1977, Jack received a phone call at home from Special Agent Riley. Riley said the FBI wanted to fly Jack to Washington for a private ceremony, that the director wanted to present him with a commendation for his actions. Jack asked if Karen could come. Riley said, "Riley, unfortunately the ceremony was classified, and Jack would need to attend alone." He also said Jack should tell his wife and his employer that he was attending a specialized training course for telephone repair, and that the FBI would provide documentation to support that cover story. Jack flew to Washington on a Tuesday morning. He was picked up at the airport by a driver who took him to FBI headquarters. He was escorted to a small conference room where Director Webster, Special Agent Riley, Special Agent Morse, and 2 other senior officials were waiting. Webster shook Jack's hand and told him that what he had done represented the best of American citizenship, that his vigilance and courage had protected national security in ways that most people would never know. Then Webster presented Jack with a plaque that read, "In recognition of exceptional service to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States of America." The plaque was dated, but included no details about what the service had involved. There were photographs taken, though Jack was told they would remain in classified files. There was a brief reception with coffee and pastries, and then Jack was driven back to the airport and flew home to Virginia, where he told Karen the training had been boring but useful, and he never mentioned that he had just been honored by the FBI director. Jack continued working as a telephone repairman for another 18 years, retiring from Chesapeake Telephone in 1995. He and Karen moved to North Carolina, bought a small house near the coast, and spent their retirement doing exactly what they had always done, raising their grandchildren, tending a garden, and living quietly. Jack told Karen the truth about the Volkov case in 2003, after the FBI declassified parts of the operation and released a summary report that briefly mentioned information provided by a civilian contractor who reported suspicious communications. Karen listened to the whole story, then asked him why he hadn't told her sooner. Jack said he had wanted to, but the rules were the rules. Karen said he was impossible, but she also said she wasn't surprised. She had always known he noticed things other people missed. Jack Mercer died in 2016 at the age of 70. His obituary mentioned that he had worked for Chesapeake Telephone Company for many years, that he was a devoted husband and father, and that he had served his country in ways his family was only beginning to understand. At the funeral, a man in a dark suit introduced himself to Jack's son as a former FBI agent who had worked with Jack decades ago. He said Jack had been one of the Bureau's most valuable assets, and that his contribution to national security could never be fully acknowledged, but would never be forgotten. The plaque that FBI Director Webster had given Jack still hangs in his son's home office. Most people who see it assume it's some kind of customer service award from the phone company. Only the family knows what it really represents. The case of the Volkov spy ring remains one of the most significant counterintelligence successes of the 1970s. It demonstrated that Soviet intelligence operations were more extensive and sophisticated than many Americans realized, that enemy agents were operating in suburban neighborhoods under deep cover, and that the line between civilian life and national security was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. But it also demonstrated something else. That ordinary people doing ordinary jobs were often the first line of defense against those operations. That a telephone repairman climbing a pole to fix static could stumble onto evidence that entire intelligence agencies had missed, and that paying attention, asking questions, and being willing to act on suspicions, even when doing so was inconvenient or frightening, was sometimes the difference between security and catastrophe. Jack Mercer climbed a utility pole on a June evening in 1977, expecting to fix a phone line. Instead, he helped bring down a spy network that had been operating successfully for years. And he did it not because he was trained in counterintelligence or because he had any special expertise in espionage. He did it because he noticed something that didn't fit, because he was curious enough to investigate, and because when he found something that mattered, he reported it to people who could act on it. The world moved on. The Cold War eventually ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The classified documents that Pavel Sokolov and Tatiana Ivanova had stolen became historical footnotes. But the principle remained: that vigilance matters, that attention matters, that ordinary citizens performing ordinary work are sometimes the only thing standing between functional security and complete compromise. And that sometimes the most important intelligence operations begin not with satellites or informants or sophisticated technology, but with a repairman on a pole who hears something he's not supposed to hear and decides to do something about it.